Fantastic.
You tell us when to go.
So, yep, the last people have joined now. I'm just waiting for them. It loads. Perfect. Yeah, that's the last person. And before we start, the last hello from Sarah Fitzgerald. So
Hi,
all
Sarah.
the way from Canada, who also says hi, and Emma Putland.
Oh,
But
hello,
now
Emma.
the stage is yours.
Okay, so thank you everybody for coming along to my little talk today on corpus-based contrastive linguistics. I'm going to talk a bit about a project I'm working on at the moment on contrastive discourse analysis of parascientific texts on climate change. Draw a little bit on a couple of other studies that I've done that kind of circle around this too. So for this talk, what I want to do initially is talk a little bit about what corpus-based contrastive analysis or discourse analysis is, and I guess what are the kind of key factors that we have to take into account when conducting this kind of research surrounding issues of comparability, the type of data, etc. And then after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that I mentioned, looking at parascientific texts and academic texts on climate change. I want to draw a little comparison with previous work that I did on COVID-19, thinking a little bit about these kind of global crises and how global crises might be articulated similarly or differently. I guess thinking about COVID as something that was emergent and something like climate change that is well established. And then a little discussion of the findings and maybe some reflections on the application of that kind of research. So, for contrastive research, corpus-based contrastive discourse analysis, the first thing I guess to think about is what kinds of data we might want to use. And this tends to fall into either parallel or comparable corpora. And parallel corpora are corpora typically kind of translation corpora that include translations and source texts. And comparable corpora then are corpora that are collected using the same sampling frame, so some kind of predetermined or predefined sampling frame that we use to create corpora. I think with the likes of parallel corpora, we can imagine that this is you can make quite large text when we look at kind of parliamentary language, for example, looking at things like Europarl, and using these kind of source texts and translations that are available. Comparable corpora are a bit more challenging to construct because they don't necessarily already exist in the wild. We have to predetermine what it is that we would like to be able to compare. We have to establish comparability, and we have to identify what kind of text we want to include or not include. So they tend to be much smaller, in fact. Comparable corpora tend to be quite specialized in nature. I'm trying to kind of remove any possible variables that would make the data incomparable. So when we look at the likes of corpora that are available as parallel corpora, we could talk about Europarl, which you can get on Sketch Engine, or the corpus, which is a large English-Chinese parallel corpus. But when we talk about the likes of comparable corpora, we can incorporate like the Kiap corpus, which is a corpus of academic writing in English, French, and Norwegian, or the corpus that I constructed with Pascual Perez, the Convidas corpus, which is a corpus on COVID-19 academic blogs from the conversation in the UK and Spain. When we're conducting this type of research, there are lots of, I guess, things that we need to consider, but the two core concepts that cut across all levels of data collection and data analysis would be the tertium comparationis and equivalence. And effectively, these are two sides of the same coin. The tertium comparationis is this notion of a comparable common ground, and typically we think of it as an assumed shared feature in text. So, for example, if questions exist in text in English and French and Spanish, then we can assume that this is a shared feature, and then we might want to test those to see whether or not they're different from one another in certain kinds of ways. And so that's where equivalence comes in, to test these types of equivalences. So it could be to frequency. Are they equally frequent in the same types of texts? Do they follow the same kind of syntactic patterns? Do they have the same function, etc.? And so we can start to add layers of nuance by adding more equivalences to test the language that we are analyzing. When we think about kind of relay this onto the types of corpora that we might analyze in contrastive linguistics, we've got parallel corpora, as I said, and with parallel corpora, we already have a predetermined tertium comparationis, right? These are translations. So the translation is that these are a version of the same text. So it's much easier to be able to make a case for comparability because they're comparable on the grounds that they are translation.
While in the likes of comparable corpus, this needs to be determined iteratively to make sure that what you're comparing is actually comparable. The reason being that if we compare things that are incomparable, that seem comparable but are incomparable, we'll come up with lots of interesting findings about look how different all of this is, but in reality the differences are meaningless. So with the likes of comparable corpora, then we have to kind of engage with this notion of falsification, where we're trying to prove that the corpus isn't comparable in all the ways that we can, so that way we can land on the kind of reasoned argument that it's relatively comparable. And I say relatively, I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And then the third little point I have here about languages is the number of languages that we might study. And typically, research in this area falls into comparisons of two languages. So I think as recent as 2017, there was an edited collection on corpus-based contrastive linguistics, where it was defined as the study and analysis of two languages in synchrony. But what I guess we see from research that looks at multiple languages is that more languages add nuance, and they add means for being able to avoid kind of binary and relative kind of definitions of language. So for example, one criteria that we might use to define languages in kind of a comparison would be to do with things like reader and writer responsibility. So is a language a reader responsible language or a writer responsible language? If it's reader responsible, it means it puts the responsibility on the reader to navigate the text. If it's writer responsible, then the responsibility is on the writer to help the reader navigate the text. And if we look at, let's say, the features of reader and writer engagement, for example, and we were to compare English and French, we would see that English has a lot more writer responsible elements, which you might expect, and French has fewer, more reader responsible or fewer writer responsible rhetorical features. Similarly, if we did the same thing with English and Spanish, we'll find the same thing. We'll find that English has more, Spanish has fewer. And so then we might be inclined to think, well, French and Spanish are like this, and English is like this, but once we add all three of them together, we actually see that there are some shared features of English and Spanish, there are some shared features of French and Spanish and English and French, and that the picture is not so simple. So the more languages that we add to a kind of a contrastive analysis, the more reasoned an argument we can make about the relationship between these languages, and avoid kind of binary positions of language X is like this, language Y is like this, which is important. And I think in general, when it comes to conducting this kind of comparative multilingual research, and this is a bit of, I guess, a catch-all caveat for this kind of research, that it's very difficult to, for example, to even compare English with other languages. How comparable can English reasonably be with any other language in the world, given its global position, given the nature of its speakers, given the spread and function and role that it affords and occupies in the world? And so we have to kind of bear in mind degrees of comparability. Like I said, things about reader and writer responsible languages. Similar, we've got notions of content and formal oriented cultures. So cultures that place more of a focus on the idea of the product of what it is that we say, or the process of what it is that we say, and how I guess that leads to kind of things like knowledge construction. The number of languages that we compare, which obviously has pragmatic constraints as well as theoretical, which is, can you reasonably do that kind of study on languages unless you speak them? And then I come to this last kind of 2 points are methodological. How do we compare them? What's our kind of way into the data? So we can talk about things being divergent or convergent analyses. And this means that when we do something like a divergent analysis, I might say, okay, I'm going to look at questions in English, and then I'm going to look at other languages. I'm going to see what are the linguistic features that perform the function that questions are performing in English. So that way I can see all the ways that this happens, which you can imagine is quite a challenge to extract that from the data. Or convergent would be, I'm going to look at questions in all three, I'm going to bring them together, I'm going to see what that looks like when I get my analysis. So that's our way into the data. And then we move in, I guess, as the point of any comparative analysis is to try and identify similarities and differences. But how do we constitute what counts as something that's similar? Is what makes for something to be kind of the same? Does it have a shared identity? And typically, I guess what we see is this movement towards things like maximum similarity and kind of manifest similarities. And this is where maybe we have manifest similarities, we might have a selection of ways things might be similar to one another. Lots of different findings. So they may have similar lengths of sentences, they may have similar forms of questions, they may have similar tenses that they use. And then what we can do is try and look at how these co-occur to come up with some maximum similarity. What are the maximally similar features that are shared across languages? So we're never really going to have the same like for like. This actually is often something that we struggle with publishing and presenting on this, is giving translations of the examples from because the point is that they're not, you can't directly translate them, and you need to go through this process to figure out what it would look like if it was actually reflective of the way these kind of questions are posed, for example, in different cultures. So it's a bit of a challenge. So with all of that, I guess the point of that really is to kind of set up a little perspective on what it means to do contrastive linguistic analyses. What are the challenges that we face? What kinds of considerations do we need to give to the data? And so all of that has gone into my thinking surrounding this ongoing work on climate discourses. And so I guess the question that might come to mind is, why should we care about climate discourses from academic and scientific texts, as opposed to maybe looking at things like media texts, things that are out in the public domain, things that are influencing and shaping society in maybe more obvious ways? And I guess this comes down to the idea of knowledge construction. We have this global crisis of climate change and climate crises unfolding in different ways, unfolding at different paces across the world. And we have these kind of global and local tensions in how these kind of discourses are constructed in different spaces. So from the previous work that I did on COVID-19, for example, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, there was clear evidence that the way in which knowledge of COVID-19 was being discursively constructed in the UK and English context was different from the way in which it was being constructed in the Spanish Spanish language context. We also see that we have this global issue that is transdisciplinary. So climate change is something that we talk about in all kinds of spaces. We might think about it in terms of scientific spaces, we might think about it in terms of environmental or geographic spaces, but also in the humanities and literature in lots of different ways. It's articulated, it's interrogated, it's critiqued. And so we've got a lot of disciplinary variation in how we understand and conceptualize the notion of climate change and climate crises. And then alongside that, we have this idea of disinformation and anti-intellectualism. So we have these views, I've heard enough experts, etc. What can we do with the kind of information that we're sharing, and why is it that this kind of information can be manipulable? Why is it that this kind of information can be dismissed by people in kind of enacting these roles of anti-intellectual? And so all of this, I guess, led me to think about, okay, well, where is our knowledge of this coming from? How do we know about climate change? How do we know about what's happening? And I started to think a little bit about what's happening in academic communication, because when we look at academic discourse, we might think of it as a type of discourse that is communicating facts, information, and knowledge, but also it's something that's extensively socially situated and that serves a social purpose in terms of communicating with different audiences, and kind of building kind of academic profiles and aiming spaces, etc. And so when I thought about this, it led me to think a little bit about how does the knowledge about climate change get constructed globally? So how are we building this knowledge of climate change globally, taking into account all of these kind of things like disciplinary variation? And so when we think a little bit about knowledge from this kind of epistemological perspective of like ways of thinking and culturally imbued ways of thinking, I think this is quite like a nice quotation from Bennett and Moore-Shan, who talk about the way in which knowledge might be perceived of or constructed or represented differently in different languages. So they say there exists an approach to scholarly work in the Romance cultures that is so different from English. Unlike English, it does not aim to transmit the facts as consciously and straightforwardly as possible, but rather delights in linguistic complexity and nuance, presenting all the data as filtered through the consciousness of the human observer. So they're kind of signaling here that there is a clear difference in the way in which we might articulate and explain what it is that we're working on in different languages. In this regard, it could be said to encode a different theory of knowledge through empiricism that underpins the English plain style, a humanistic orientation that is more holistic,
in that it values subjectivity, aesthetics, and ethics, and motivity as essential components of knowledge. So I guess thinking about this, then it raises the question as to how does this influence the way in which we frame and construct knowledge on climate discourses in different languages. And then if we think about disciplinary variation in this regard, we know that discipline is well established as a key variable in academic writing studies. So the way in which language differs across disciplines is actually greater than the way in which language differs across languages in academic discourse studies. So discipline is a critical kind of variable in this kind of study, and it socially situates us within this kind of this notion of an academic tribe. So discipline is our social space for being able to construct knowledge. We have shared norms, shared bodies of knowledge, conventions, mode of inquiry, and cultures, and through that we express things in a way that we understand that our audience will get, right? We take shortcuts. We know that they're going to understand us. But when we're working on such a transdisciplinary issue, as things are potentially moving across different disciplinary boundaries, what is it that we're doing that might not necessarily make our work accessible to different spaces and different kinds of discourses? So this led me to think a little bit about the implications for studying academic and parascientific texts on climate discourses. So when I wanted to kind of dig into that, I thought a little bit about, what's already happening on multilingual studies of climate discourses. And studies in this area typically focus on the likes of social media, newspapers, government policies, looking at the ways in which different kinds of languages construct and frame climate change in different ways. So Daryl's study was quite strong in this regard, looked at quite a number of languages and identified that cultural variation plays a critical role in determining kind of the discursive construction of key issues, noting that, for example, in the likes of Brazil and Brazilian Portuguese, deforestation is the key area of focus. So this is what is focused on when we talk about climate change. So we're starting to see kind of like thematic differences in the way cultures articulate or focus on issues. Not so surprising given the geographical context. In the likes of Germany, however, we have things like climate skepticism. So this would be an area that's of critical focus in media texts in German contexts. And so I guess when we think about these spaces, social media, newspapers, government policy, this is where information is being disseminated en masse to a large number of audiences, but it's not necessarily where this information is initially developed. Where is this knowledge constructed? Where does it come from and how does it make its way into these spaces? And actually, there's a very limited focus on academic or parascientific communication around climate discourses generally, and very little, again, still on multilingual perspectives, which was surprising. So to kind of wrap all of that up, what is the problem? Well, we know academic knowledge is a source of information on key issues in the world, for example, climate change. We know that academic knowledge construction and dissemination varies across cultures and languages. We see that there's a rise in disinformation and anti-intellectualism on key issues like climate change, which are having an impact on the way in which people accept, engage with kind of knowledge that's being constructed in the likes of university spaces. And that culture is critical in determining the discursive construction of key issues on climate change across languages, which means that we need to understand how cultures are doing this differently so that we can have a full picture and not just be looking at smaller spaces and local spaces. So how can we resolve this? And what I think is that our understanding of how academic knowledge of this global issue is localized and constructed across languages, etc., is unclear. We don't really know what's happening. We know that it's happening, but we don't know what's happening. And so the kind of movement to understand global and local and cross-linguistic and cross-disciplinary practices in climate change knowledge construction help us develop a more shared understanding of this kind of global issue on a global stage, and effectively moving between kind of local and global perspectives. So the aim of this research then is to develop a multilingual corpus that would allow us to kind of dig into this discourse and see what's happening, to conduct these kind of analyses, and to identify potential points of synergy or ambiguity in how things are being represented across these languages. And for the study that I'm working on, I'm focusing on English, French, and Spanish. So I've built this multilingual corpus of academic research articles and blogs from the Conversation UK and from a number of different journals. So what I did, so you're probably gonna, I've highlighted the 71 here. That might look a bit strange, and I'll explain my thinking surrounding that in a moment here. So what I did for each of I started with the academic blogs, and I used the Conversation UK, the Conversation Spain, and the Conversation France. And I looked at this around a particular key event, which was COP26. So I looked at texts that occurred before COP26 and texts that occurred after COP26. So I could have that as like a pivotal moment to see whether or not any discourses changed at that point in time. The number of articles I chose was 142 articles, so 71 before, 71 after, which is again maybe a little bit of a strange number. But the rationale for that is that in the Spanish text, that's the maximum number that I could get. So there were fewer texts published in the Spanish language. So I led with the smallest number of texts available in Spanish, and then I mirrored it in French, which had more, and English, which had more still. And then what I also did was I extracted the information about all the authors of those blogs, and I made a long list, and I made a small corpus of 20 research articles in each language, where I identified research articles written by those same authors on the same topics, so that I could compare whether or not they were talking about the same thing in different ways for different audiences in their own language. So 20 articles in English, 20 articles in French, 20 articles in Spanish. And then what I did was I looked at a couple of different criteria that we can extract from the conversation to make sense of that. So whether they were single or multi-authored. I categorized them into hard and soft sciences, which is a bit of a crude categorization, but broad enough to actually reasonably draw comparisons. When we look at the way in which disciplinary areas are articulated by the conversation, it's very atomized in English. So we've got lots of really small, specific disciplinary areas that are often transdisciplinary. And then when we look at other languages like Spanish, that's not necessarily the case. It's a little bit more traditional in terms of the ways in which these kind of disciplinary areas are indexed. So I organized it in this way, led me to these kind of macro view of whether they're engaging in kind of hard sciences, generally soft sciences, or whether it's kind of an interdisciplinary, it's a mixture of parts. So they can include texts from over 200 authors in each case, from a range of countries, and you can see in descending order of engagement. So the English texts are more international, so the authors from a larger number of countries than French and then Spanish still. And similarly, that has an effect on the institutions, which makes sense. So there are more institutions represented in the English data than in the French and Spanish. And then in this, I looked at the kind of the distribution of texts in different stages. So I did it in kind of several month intervals, so that way I could see whether or not there are any changes or in kind of areas of focus that could be linked to perhaps events that are happening around the country at those points in time. You'll notice that in the Spanish one, I've highlighted the 71, so there's a large number of hard science texts in the Spanish data when compared to the other data, and that's just the nature of what is discussed on the website. So this is what I guess is the key focus in the conversation in Spain. A lot of it is focusing on the hard sciences and less so on the soft sciences. So just something to flag up as a potential variable that could influence the data. And so for this analysis, what I did was I looked at stance nouns that are followed by that in each language. So I looked at this kind of metadiscursive feature of stance nouns because this allowed me a way into looking at particular linguistic feature as a convergent analysis. So this feature exists in all three languages. I can look at it. It forms a particular function of being able to give a kind of a claim in some way, evidencing some kind of claim. That often will come in line with things like citations or data or evidence that can be used to support it. So things like the idea that, like sans doute que or el hecho de que. So it was the que and it was the de que in Spanish that would allow me to do that. And what I did was, from a previous study that I did with Pascal Perez on COVID discourses, I took a list of stance nouns from that corpus, from that analysis in English and Spanish. And then I replicated the approach for the French, and I also searched for other stands so I could get as many as possible. And I searched for all examples to kind of put together this larger list of potential items. Can you see that? Potential items without where these were present. And so the frequency in in words, in the research articles in the academic blogs, and the range there. So we see that this is more common in English already than it is in French and Spanish, but it is a feature that runs across many texts. Which is interesting. And also, I worked with an existing framework that we developed by bringing together a number of different frameworks that was published in this paper, this COVID-19 special issue paper in IJCL, where we talked about the kind of function, the semantic function of these nouns. So we grouped them into these kind of semantic categories. Are they argumentative? Or they issuing kind of cause and effect, expressing evaluation, hinging on evidence? Was it future oriented? Was it focusing on facts, indexing things with facts or ideas? Was it about things being newsworthy in a sense, or looking at kind of possibility? And when I did this, I found a couple of different kind of interesting things. So the first, and I'll talk a little bit about how this compares to the COVID research a little later. The first thing was a general convergence, that in all three languages, the focus was on facts. So in the discourses surrounding climate change, there was a focus on fact, and this was the most common in each language and also in each type of text. So in both research articles and academic blogs. And we can see things here like the fact that, I can't read that from there, is the fact that unsustainable management of biodiversity and so on, etc. What's interesting in this little example that I've taken from the website is you can see the use of hyperlinks here to be able to link out to examples of evidence to support the claims that they're making. When we see the use of the fact that in the blogs in English, we often see the use of evidence to support it. Interestingly, in the research articles in English, there was less evidence to support the claims they were making when they were citing things as facts. It wasn't as common, which was surprising. In these little French and Spanish examples here, we see the to the K being used in a very similar way, but that both French and Spanish appear to use less evidence in supporting claims. So, and this is actually quite typical of both French and Spanish language, which is not as much of a practice of citation, and so a kind of authorial identity can be stronger. And when we look at kind of other popular stance nouns that were occurred in the likes of English, we've got things like evidence, claim, idea, issue. In Spanish, we have things like posibilidad, necesidad. So these are kind of your possibility nouns, duda, so doubt. And then in French, we've got hypothèse. So this is like hypothesis. Effet, which is looking at kind of cause and effect, and sounds like a sense of an idea, something like that. And I guess when we look within the kinds of texts, so the English research articles and English blogs, French research articles, French blogs, we have differences that occur. So we're going to ignore the fact that the fact that is the most common stance noun used in all languages. And when we look past that to see what else is going on, we see that the likes of argument is used quite a lot in research articles, so this kind of argumentative approach, which isn't necessarily so surprising. But then in the blogs, is kind of these notions of kind of bringing in ideas, the theory. So there's a slight difference there in that the kind of language that's being used to develop these kind of arguments. In the French, we have because the second area of focus is largely on things like possibility and doubt. So we've got the idea of the possibility of something happening in research articles, but then we have in French, when we see doubt, we say without doubt, right? So you've got sans doute, so it's kind of minimizing the kind of the uncertainty in a way. So that's happening in the blogs, whereas in the research articles, we're kind of seeing an indexing of more hedging in a sense, where they're not necessarily making a strong claim. And then in the likes of the Spanish text, and I thought this was quite an interesting difference, that when we look at the research articles, we see things like hypothesis. So these are, I guess, are proposing potential ideas, potential perspectives. Whereas in Spanish, we see things like evidence being kind of cited more, but so fuertes evidencias de que, so fuertes means strong, so strong evidence, that and so on. So a different kind of perspective being kind of demonstrated. I also, for this data, did I looked at keyness. I looked at keywords and key terms. And one kind of thing, I guess emerged from the keyword analysis and key term analysis that I thought was quite interesting, were kind of thematic foci. So in the English data, for example, I saw quite a lot of recurring words that focus on things related to the economy. And this was much more common in the English text than it was in the French and Spanish, and across both texts I'm talking here, research articles and blogs, so things like carbon tax. In the French examples, we have things like these kind of natural environmental spaces being indexed, so things like forêt naturelle. And then in Spanish, we see a little focus on things like biodiversity and species protection. So the Perdida de Biodiversidad. So in this context, I think what this shows is that while this might be a shared issue, and we may be using similar kinds of language in some ways to be able to frame the knowledge that we're presenting, we can see some kind of variance in terms of how evidence is being used to support those claims that we're making. When we dig past the most common trends, that there are differences in the way that we present it within languages across texts, but also across languages. And the areas of focus for these texts are quite different, looking at different areas of priority that relate to climate change, which is such a big issue. We should probably remember that for the Spanish text, there was a lot more of a focus on hard sciences, which may influence some of the focus on kind of species protection, but it's not a problem because that's what they're talking about. They're talking about hard science more, and they're talking about this more. Okay, so I'll come back to that in a little moment, but what I want to do is kind of draw your attention to maybe some differences that we found in the COVID study, so we can see how this maybe compares when we compare two global crises. So we did a very similar thing in the COVID study where we looked at COVID-19 texts for the conversation, but this was just in English and Spanish, and did the same kind of analysis where we look at stance and all of these out. And what we see is that when we look at the stance structures in convidas across languages, that like with the climate change corpora, it was a very similar kind of dispersion or very similar kind of use of language, though English had more. In general, there was, if you recall, for the range of spread for the blogs, for example, of stance nouns in English, in Spanish and French, they were lower than English. In the COVID stuff, it was pretty equal actually. So there was a lot more invoking of stance in Spanish in COVID than there was necessarily in climate. Sorry. And when we look at the kinds of language in the kinds of semantic areas that they use to frame this information, we've got things like possibility and factualness being used in Spanish language, which is quite different from what we're seeing in the climate discourses. While English is still focusing largely on argumentation, so argumentation kind of spreading across them. When we kind of try to unpack some of this, what we see is that overall there's a shared usage in kind of climate discourses language, that there's differences across the semantic categories in each language, and that I think overall what this can help us do is kind of denaturalize notions of knowledge construction across languages and texts by giving us this kind of this interdisciplinary but also multilingual perspective. When we look at discipline, we see hard science using fewer examples of stance nouns, smaller ranges of these kinds of nouns that are being used, and less evaluative language like claim in the hard science, which is quite interesting, I think, when we even when we look at the words like claim, because they also have a different semantic value in different disciplinary areas. So when we think about claim in the humanities, often it will be used to have some type of evaluation, that we don't necessarily fully agree with what's being represented. However, in the hard sciences, claim doesn't necessarily have that kind of strength of meaning, and that it may actually just be a claim because they don't necessarily work in the idea of things being entirely true, factual, just something to be falsified. When I guess we look across different languages, disciplines, and texts, there are a lot of challenges that I cited at the beginning. I think the more data we can get, the better to be able to kind of really see what the trends that are emerging. But even in this corpus of 1 million or so words, already there's quite a lot of fruitful information emerging. The challenge with comparable data is that it's hard to get lots of comparable data, because the more you add, the less comparable it becomes. Things have variables in them that make them less comparable. And you never know what's going to be the thing that influences the text. When we compare the kind of global crises and the languages of global crises from similar spaces, we see that COVID-19, for example, we see that there are fewer slants in climate discourse than COVID-19. So people are making more claims about COVID than they were about climate change. It appears less international as an area of focus. So the emergence of COVID led to a lot of international engagement, and that was represented in the kind of texts that were produced, the kind of transdisciplinary texts that were produced, and international texts that were produced, and that wasn't the case in the climate discourses. And that they do indicate similar differences in evidence usage and stance framing and authorial identity. So there's evidence of clear differences as we look across cultures and how knowledge around this is being A, framed, and B, the kind of topics that are of interest in these different cultural spaces. So over to this one. So in terms of applications, I guess where I'm kind of pushing this is to think a little bit about how information about the way in which knowledge is constructed and shared from university spaces can be, I guess, guided by an understanding, epistemological understandings of positionings of this type of research. So how could something like this influence peer review in the way in which we give guidance to people who are reviewing research coming from different cultural spaces, and what value does an openness to different ways of articulating this kind of knowledge afford, but also what challenges does it bring with trying to get a clear global picture of a very complex issue. Similarly with the likes of publishing guidelines, and maybe a movement towards this idea of multilingual publishing. Multilingual publishing will bring in these more epistemological perspectives, which may afford more ways of thinking. And there's lots of really nice research in this area that I think that looks at examples of, I think Swales wrote about this, where some discovery that happened in German in the 1950s and in Portuguese in the 1970s with the same discovery again, and then in English in the 90s, and then thereafter it was knowledge that people knew about. So different knowledge is happening in different spaces, and we're missing out on it by not necessarily being able to get a full picture of what's happening. And then I think this has impact on kind of public outreach and engagement, where we can use this to be able to get kind of share intercultural perspectives on a shared global but also local issue. Likewise, I think that this can also be valuable for the likes of language education. So I think that we can see an impact route where we think a little bit about the way we can use corpus linguistics and contrastive linguistics to be able to influence language education. So this is from a chapter I published recently on contrastive linguistics for language education, thinking a little bit about the affordances of contrastive linguistics, which is that it's multilingual, that it's typically very specialized when we look at comparable corpora, and multicultural, and also thinking about the kind of, the future directions in language education and education more generally, which is that it's plurilinguistic, that it focuses more and more on specialized language for very specific learner needs, and that there's this big movement towards developing kind of global citizens and intercultural citizens. And I think that by this kind of research that looks at language across these intercultural spaces is ideal really for being able to feed into the development of educational materials, curricula, and I think it's a space in which corpus linguistics can bring contrastive linguistics into the fore, but also contrastive linguistics to shape corpus linguistic practices in language education. So these are a couple of things that I'm looking at as moving forward. Okay, so thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Yes, I guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess these days it's fairly common to have academic texts written in English by L2 speakers of other languages. Would you expect, or do you get a feel for, in a text like that, whether it would have, say, an English paper written by a Spanish academic would have Spanish speeches, or would they have the English language speeches?
Yeah, I think it's probably most likely a hybrid is what you'll see. So there is I guess it depends on the type of spaces. There are kind of publishing conventions that shape this. So any kind of academic text that we're looking at really isn't the product of an individual alone, but it's the product of the entire suite of editorial and publication processes. I know, for example, when I published a chapter in a book being published in America, and they made me change all my spelling and take out all my pronouns. Just like, if you read that and thought, oh, Niall doesn't use any of these, I do, I just didn't use it there. So there are these kinds of factors that influence the individual authors. So I guess when we look at it in the wholesale, we're thinking about it as being representative of the academic community that writes in these languages. But having said that, you do see in kind of contrastive linguistic studies that look at maybe English versus Spanish and also second language English users of Spanish for the same purposes, some variation where maybe they might have longer sentences, for example, or more embedded sentences, which would be typical of Spanish. So definitely you see a bit of a mix. I think that's part of what makes, so English is its own thing in that sense. It makes English quite incomparable to other languages because the makeup of English is not as homogeneous as maybe other languages might be, in that you do have, in very real terms, people speak small languages writing in English, which is what makes up the academy in a sense. So it's representative, but it's not, yeah, it's not homogeneous.
Just want to follow up this discussion about second language learners. I think the problem is that there has been quite a lot of research, especially by Helen, into the stance taking by second language learners. It has been found that second language learners, for example, Chinese learners, they cannot express their stance properly using English. For example, they tend to make a very strong claim. So I think, so it can somehow, because you are looking at the stance making, so I don't know whether you had taken that into.
Well, in this case, what I'm looking at is, in the case of, for example, French and Spanish, it's first language French and Spanish, so people publishing through those languages. And in the case of the English, I'm looking at professional publications by academics. And for example, in order to publish in the conversation, you need to hold a post in a university where you're actively working and researching. So the implication there, I think, is not that these are language learners per se. These are professional users and competent users of the language. They will use it in slightly different ways, but so does everyone. I think to the point to which, I mean, sometimes I get feedback on my writing when I publish saying this should be proofread by a native speaker because they don't like my little Irishisms, you know, but I'm gonna put them in. So I think, yeah, there are variables across within groups, absolutely, but I think that it's not learner language in that sense. That makes sense.
I may have missed it, but I wondered if you had information about number of editors of the articles in the conversation, whether like it's the same editor. Because I know when I wrote in the conversation, I had different editors, and some of them are very, very hands-on, and they completely change. They rewrite every sentence, and then they make you put. You know, I was interested when you showed that. You know, you have those links, to kind of like. You know, and some of them make you do that a lot, and some of them don't. So I wondered. You know, because it's the same kind of topic. Maybe they've got one person who deals with like climate change.
Question.
And yeah, or maybe there's like 8 people who are doing it. I don't know whether or not that information comes up on the article, does it? You get the name of the person, but I'm not sure how you would even find that out. But that could impact on kind of whether it's a consistent style or whether different things.
Absolutely, that's a great. I don't have information on that, but I think that's something that I'm absolutely going to look into. It's a great idea. I don't think it is available on the site. On individual articles, but I'm sure it's information that would be accessible in some regard. Yeah, so I'll look into that. That's a really good idea.
Focus on stents. Where to next? Because that's only one way of encoding.
Yeah,
and I was thinking about the sense that you put in. beginning where you said, you know, if you just look at one thing, you can get highly convergent. If you look at other things, you get ideas of true similarity.
Yeah,
So the sort of way my point is running is if you looked at a broad set of features, may you find that something that isn't encoded stands nouns in French is actually encoded, but with a different feature elsewhere in the sentence.
Definitely. So I think you're absolutely right that in the case of this study, this is a linguistic analysis of stance nouns, right? So that's what it's telling us about how stance nouns are used, but it's not necessarily able to tell us about how stances articulate or even how the functions of stance in one language are represented in different ways in different languages. So I think what would be next would be a divergent analysis where instead of taking a top-down framework of like these are the linguistic features that we'll look for that help help us find representative language of X, Y, and Z, it would be about doing kind of bottom-up analyses through keyword analysis, for example, to try and find language chunks that would then maybe signal something relevant or interesting as a way in. Also, I think it would require kind of small-scale out of the corpus coding, right? Like close reading of the text to pull out these kind of examples to quite a qualitative approach to get a big picture.
I wonder if another way of doing it would be, I don't know if you can do this with French and Spanish yet, but you can do it with English. You could use multiple correspondence analysis.
Yes.
And carry that out on the text and then see whether you're getting bundles of features which are coming together. And when you look at them, find texts which are encoding knowledge in a certain way, but you're actually able to account for multiple features coming together to do it. Because you've got that sort of clustering of the grammatical features going on. So maybe you should talk to Izzy.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
Do that in English text and see what happens. Because her text set has stance coded in a range of ways. You get be as a main verb in her text as well, which is more.
Yes.
So that might be a nice little test to do to see whether you can actually operationalize your sort of multiple divergent analysis.
Yes, indeed, that's a nice idea.
And see whether they actually do come together in both. So are those en fait also accompanied by a whole range of other things in French?
I think you're right.
Just saying this is true, this is true, this is true. Or is it modalized somewhere where you're wrong, which actually solves it?
Yeah, I think you're right in assuming that these will co-occur with other kinds of stance and engagement features and other kinds of rhetorical evaluation features. They do tend to. So that's a good point to look at these kind of co-occurring features.
You can do it in English now.
Yeah. Yeah, and then maybe you can help me make French and Spanish.
That would be really valuable. But you'd also, of course, then have to make sure that you had some sort of common ground for the orthosyntactic analysis. Otherwise, you're just getting divergence.
Absolutely.
And it's probably possible between those three languages. We had Chinese. Much more different. But you know, three highly related languages. You go back to the Eagles work on syntactic tag sets. You work from there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I have two questions from Lawrence Anthony online, so I'm going to be the amplify those. The first one is, and I think that's about the reference articles we talked about, the 20 you collected. Lawrence was asking what journals those came from.
Oh, I'm trying to think. There's quite a spread, so I don't have that information to hand, but I can send you some information about it, Lawrence. The way that I did that was I identified all of the authors, and I just created a single list of all of the authors, and then I decided, because this I guess is an initial, I wanted to see if there was anything to be done if I were to collect texts in this way and compare them. So my arbitrary mark of 20 research articles is arbitrary in that this was a proof of concept in a sense to see if it would work. And so what I did was I did a random selection of 20 authors out of that list, and then I looked for research articles. I didn't necessarily I considered journals in the regard that they needed to be kind of peer-reviewed professional publications, etc. But actually, what was more important was the proximity of the thematic focus of the research articles and the blogs that they had written themselves. So that was kind of my selection criteria. I can tell you that the journals are peer-reviewed academic publications, but I can't recall off the top of my head the journals because there were so many. Because I guess if we think about, let's say if we just talk about the English data alone, the soft sciences span sociology, linguistics, history, the hard sciences spanned all kinds of areas of science that I probably can't even pronounce. So lots of different areas of focus. So off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you, but I do have the information, so I'm happy to share, Lawrence.
Okay, fabulous. Then a follow-up from Lawrence asking if there were any review articles among those.
No, not
Okay.
at all. I did include, so I included research articles, and I included theoretical papers, but not meta-linguistic analyses or review articles.
Okay, thank you so much. And then one more, unless we have more in the room, which was also Lawrence asking if you investigated where in the research papers the similar phrases appeared. So, for example, the fact that, was there a more sort of, was that, for example, in the discussion sections or?
Yeah, good question. Short answer is no, but I'm aware that that does have an impact in that looking at the individual spaces. And a challenge with kind of contrastive linguistic analyses and looking at research articles is that as you look across disciplines and languages, they are not the same. So you have introductions, sometimes you have conclusions, and then whatever is in between can be a mixed bag. Some of them will have methods, some of them won't. So labeling everything and kind of going into that micro makes it actually kind of hard. So typically what you see in contrastive linguistic studies that span a number of disciplines and languages is that they call it a kind of a thematic middle section that deals with lots of different things. And I guess then you would have to do like a micro focus on those articles that do contain, let's say, methods, sections, etc. to see. I think that would be interesting to look at, but it's not something that I have looked at. But I take that will influence the function for sure.
Policy and policy questions. One thing that occurs to me is you might quickly look at the different national contexts to see whether, especially in the hard sciences, to see if there have been thematic calls in this area.
Yes, absolutely.
Funders are distorting what's written about.
Yeah.
So you're seeing talk about
biodiversity.
Is it because the Spanish Research Council has formed a big program of that? So you're seeing lots of papers come out about it.
Yeah.
Or is it, you might argue, something about Spain, which actually makes people focus on that? But it did strike me as the kind of distortion that you might get.
That makes sense, yeah.
The other thing that I thought about with reference to policy, again, this is really a question, it's an observation, is that there must be consequences for these conceptualizations of knowledge in terms of communicating between national governments. If you look at something like COP, if they're all going along with different conceptualizations of what's a fact, then actually arguing this out must be quite difficult. Because, you get
and whatever they result in might not be a shared understanding of that result either.
Right. So you could do a similar thing with policy papers.
Yes,
and maybe analysis of discussion at the governmental level to see whether in fact there are sort of fault lines being produced by these epistemologies, which actually is making agreement more difficult to produce, possibly a naive thought, but it might actually be.
Yeah, indeed.
I have more online questions. This one's from Sarah Fitzgerald asking, did you have trouble coming up with the search terms to extract the articles for your corpus?
Not necessarily. So what I did was I used, so in terms of the initial corpus that I built, it was based on the conversation UK, France and Spain. And that was chosen because it's comparable in terms of the relatively in terms of the editorial practices and policies and in terms of what it is that it's meant to be doing as a type of text. And it's hosted by the same organization. So that was kind of my way into it. And then by, I guess, extracting the authors, I was able to identify the people that I would select for the research articles. But again, that's just that's quite a small corpus of 60 articles, 20 in each language. So I'll expand that. And I was able to then also use kind of keyword analysis from the corpora themselves, from the blogs themselves, trying to get a sense of like the aboutness of these texts and like what is it that I'm looking for, so I could see how that corresponded to the articles that were represented. But that was more secondary, because once I had a list of authors, I was able to look, and I could also look at the years in which they published the papers and whether that was around the same time at which they were writing the blogs, etc. And I could try to find correspondences. So that was quite detailed work in terms of actually looking through articles and making sure that they did thematically relate to each other.
Okay, perfect. And then I have one more by Erin Stock, who's asking, were there any results that surprised you particularly?
Yeah, I guess I'm not surprised per se, but I was really intrigued by the thematic differences that emerged. So this kind of focus on the economy in the UK and the focus on kind of environmental spaces in France and species and biodiversity in Spain. And I guess I've lived in all three countries now, so I was able to think that makes sense. That makes sense. In some ways, it was a comforting finding, but I think an interesting cultural insight into how culture can be really very, very clearly indexed in something like climate change discourses and scientific texts, which I think is quite, so maybe not surprising, but in that sense, it was quite intriguing.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. For now, that's it from the online audience.
Point about the economy is interesting for the UK. I think there is work on it in discourse analysis that the economization of the UK. Sometimes people talk about marketization, which is specifically more about viewing things in economic terms and balance, and then using free market ideas in order to assess ideas. So that one's interesting to see that, but I wasn't aware of the other sort of forms of reasoning.
Yeah,
there's definitely a body of literature to link to that.
Definitely, yes.
That looks like it now.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you, everybody online.
Thank you indeed.
Right.
And you can stop recording.
Fabulous. Yes. We've stopped.